Without further ado, I will introduce Brooke, who will give our introduction of Mackenzie today. Before.
All right. Hi, everybody. I am Brooke. I will be introducing Mackenzie, and I'm quite excited. GIS is complicated. I've taken the class, and I appreciate your work that you do, Mackenzie, for sure. So today I do have the pleasure of introducing Mackenzie. Mackenzie is involved in GIS and also is also involved in policy analysis. She didn't specifically choose this career path. Experience for Mackenzie had opened the door to go towards this career path. Mackenzie has always enjoyed maps and learned GIS at her previous jobs. After that job, she had worked at a research and worked with Dr. John Freemuth. And this is kind of when a job opportunity opened up for her and how she kind of got into this career and the direction she is going. Mackenzie has not always lived in Boise. Before she had moved here, she was living in Washington, D.C. After college, she got an internship in D.C. at the U.S. House of Representatives. After her internship with the U.S. House of Representatives, Mackenzie had worked in fundraising at a Bipartisanship Policy Center. The Bipartisanship, also known as BPC, is a policy institute. A policy institute is a research-based institute that performs research on topics that include economics, military, technology, and culture. For the most part, these organizations are non-governmental organizations. And lastly, Mackenzie ended with a job in DC working with Defender of Wildlife, which is an organization that is dedicated into protecting and restoring endangered species and habits in North America. Once she parted ways with working at Defender of Wildlife, she moved to Boise to go to grad school. What Mackenzie enjoys most about her job is being able to interact with other people, interacting with those she works with and those who she is working with indirectly, because there is a wide range of experts and she can learn more about topics that she is not an expert in. Mackenzie has been the most surprised in policy analysis for the amount of flexibility of work that she has worked on herself. All research grants differ. Everyone on the grant works in different locations all over the United States. As far as her GIS work goes, the thing that surprised her the most is how fast technology is evolving. The advice Mackenzie would give her younger self would be to trust your instincts and value your mentors. Mackenzie would not have gone to Boise State if it was not for Dr. Freemuth. Mackenzie and Dr. Freemuth had a good conversation about her academic and professional goals. After this conversation, she knew that Boise State was her school and Idaho was her state. With having to study public lands, Mackenzie knew there would be opportunities to open up. There were other opportunities that Mackenzie could have picked from as far as school-wise, but deep down, she knew that Idaho was the right place for her. Idaho just offered more opportunities, especially when she wanted to put her focus on public land issues in the West. This would not have been possible if it was done in the East Coast. The challenges Mackenzie faces within her career in GIS is learning how to navigate bureaucracy. This is because the world of GIS is collecting the spatial data that can be processed, and this can take up for days and weeks to get approved. A concern arises for research grants and the concern for sustained funding. If Mackenzie had chosen a different career path, she would be doing more with wild conservation. In that field, she would have chosen to be a wildlife biologist. Her focus would be on the land management side of the wildlife conservation. Now I'm going to hand it over to Mackenzie and can't wait to learn more and discuss about GIS.
Thanks, Brooke. And I'll give a little bit of clarification since research grants are complicated. So I technically work for Boise State, but the research grant is from USGS. So I'm a Boise State employee, so anything I say about the project doesn't necessarily reflect USGS's position. And I'm also a PhD student at BSU as well, in public administration and public policy, and that'll eventually get done. And I think my parents are on this call too, so I will say that I did move back to Idaho as well to be closer to them. So I thought I'd mention that since they're probably listening. So I will go ahead and get started. Let me know if, okay, let me figure out the screen share thing. I should be an expert in this by now, but okay. Can you guys see my screen? Okay, great. Okay, so I struggled with how to present this. So I'm going to avoid a lot of technical things since I recognize that a lot of you, especially students, may or may not have familiarity with GIS. So at the end of the presentation, if I say something that doesn't make any sense, feel free to ask or send me a message in the chat box and I can further clarify that. Okay, so first, what is GIS? It stands for Geographic Information System, and there are various definitions you can find from various sources, like Esri's source, which is, I think, the biggest GIS software company. What people will usually use is ArcGIS. USGS also has a similar definition, but overall, it's really the key point of GIS is the spatial component. So it's data management with a location attached. This is just an example from the database that I work on, where I'll talk about in a little bit of what it kind of looks like in the software. This was a query that I did for national forests and national parks in Utah. And there are a lot of other rows that I didn't show. But eventually, this kind of data can look something like this. I just actually learned this. I had to do a little bit of research on the history of GIS because honestly, even doing it for so long, I didn't really know. And it turns out, at least based on the information I found, that it originated in Canada in the 1960s by a man named Roger Tomlinson. And he worked for I think he was actually British in origin, but he worked for the Canadian government, as well as some various computer companies to create the Canada Geographic Information System. And a lot of that included mapping out Canada's forest lands and other natural resources. And that's how we get the name GIS. There are two basic types of GIS data. The first type is vector data, and that's mainly what I'll be talking about today because raster data is really complicated. And that usually deals with shapes, lines, and points. So for example, in this really, really simple graphic, this is very oversimplified, that would be a shape of a lake. The lines might be rivers, and then you might have points for wells. Raster data is a little bit more complicated, and I won't talk too much about that, but that's basically on a grid. And those are usually, they vary by size, but like they might be a 30 by 30 meter grid, but each cell in that grid. So if you think about a grid and each cell would have a different value, and that can vary with different information, but I'll give some examples. This is an example that I pulled up of what a vector file might look like. So this is from Wilderness Connect, that I think is run out of University of Montana or Montana State. I can't remember which one, but it's from wilderness.net, and they have shapes of all the wilderness areas in the US, and on their online map, you can click on those shapes and it'll give you more information. These are just some examples of raster data. One big one is elevation. So each different point has a different value for elevation. They also do slope and other attributes. This is another project that the program I work under works on. This is land cover. It's unfortunately, I can't really zoom in on this map, but this is every point has a different vegetation class, and it all comes together to build this map of land cover of the US. And another example is species modeling. So each point represents a different level of species richness, in this case, mammals. You can use GIS. I actually honestly can't think of anything you can't use GIS for. This is an example from recreation.gov using points data. I should mention that a lot of GIS is online now, so you don't necessarily need software to access it, or at least to view it. And then everybody has a phone, I assume, with navigation systems on it that also uses GIS data with, some satellite data as well. This is a really good example of how GIS data has really evolved and is really relevant today. This is a map from Esri, which again I mentioned is probably the largest program and company for GIS, but they host a variety of web maps on ArcGIS Online, and I think they collaborate with other agencies like NIFC for things like wildfires, so they have live wildfire maps. If I have time, I'll go back and I can click through some of these so you can see what they look like live. Some sources for GIS data for public lands that I would recommend starting off with. Every agency, or I think almost every, I'm pretty sure every agency, public lands agency has a GIS website where they do host free data. BLM has one. The two I just brought up, the websites that I just brought up are the Forest Service and BLM. You can just Google, for example, Bureau of Land Management GIS, and it'll bring you to their portal. Same thing with the Forest Service. And one nice thing is they usually all have online viewers, so you don't need software to view the data. Here's just an example that I used from BLM's database with their web viewer. I don't know if you guys were in Boise when the soda fire hit, but I was curious what other fires looked like, a long time ago in that area. The really, really large red outline is the soda fire, and then these other smaller shapes are fires from previous years or decades. And I didn't obviously make any conclusions from this map since I'm not a fire person, but using these kind of maps as reference maps to actually look into something you might want to research is a really good tool. So you might ask questions, like what did invasive species look like in these areas, in previous years? What management techniques were they using for fires in previous years? Were they prescribed or were they natural? But again, these kind of maps can really be a good starting place for finding a research topic and further exploring a research topic. I was going to try and do this live, but I realized that my internet connection would probably slow us down. As I mentioned, most agency websites have online map capabilities. So, for example, if I know we talked a lot about Indigenous issues in the previous week, so I looked on the Forest Service's GIS warehouse, and I clicked on their map service for tribal ceded lands, brought it up in ArcGIS's online web viewer, which is free to the public, by the way. The software is more expensive. I'm not 100% sure what student access is at Boise State, but I will try and find that out later. And then brought it up in ArcGIS's online map, and this is all automatically populated. I just had to look for places in Idaho, and I used a filter to do that. But the nice thing about online GIS is there's very little coding, if none involved, and you can create really, really simple maps. Like, for example, this is one that I just made in about 5 minutes, just using queries and filters, and then just changing the colors of the map of tribal ceded lands that, either were in Idaho or overlapped with Idaho. Obviously, a lot of these treaties and decisions happen before Idaho is a state, but you can, as I said, there's always more information attached to that geospatial aspect, so I can click on that area that I'm interested in, and in this case, that data has a link for the actual tree that's referenced. The project that I work on as a BSU collaborator is the USGS Protected Areas Database of the United States. It is under, apologies, I have to look at my notes from on my other computer because I realize I don't have split screen ability. It's a project, it's under the USGS Science Analytics and Synthesis program. This is the main website for other projects that are under that program. There's also species data and land cover data that I don't work on necessarily, but other people under that program work on. But I primarily work on the Protected Areas Database of the United States. PADUS is the authoritative source for combined public lands, protected areas and public lands data. You'll always want to go to the agency that you're interested in for the most up-to-date data, since we really only update this, at least with the federal lands, once a year, and then state and local lands a little bit less, depending on what data is available. And to do this, we work with different data stewards. So we have contacts at all the federal agencies, except for, I think we're still looking for somebody for Department of Energy and maybe one or two others, but the main ones like Forest Service, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service. We all have a data contact that provides us the data every year, and we compile it basically to create these type of maps. And protected areas, I know at the beginning of the class, I think Emily asked you what public lands meant to you. It's kind of the same with protected areas. It can really encompass a lot of different types of land. So we have everything from conservation easements or privately conserved areas to local parks, to state lands and state parks, all the way up to what most people are familiar with federal lands such as national parks, and then multiple use lands, national forests, etc. But it's really it's a really broad definition, but there's a lot in there. The key attributes that we end up tracking are some of the basics are ownership and management boundaries, i.e. who owns the land and who manages it, and that can be different in some cases, and in some cases there's joint management. A good example is like City of Rocks in Idaho. I might get this mixed up, but I believe it's owned by the state but managed by BLM. We also track public access. And there are 4 categories for that: unknown, we don't know, and that's usually on private land; restricted, and that usually means that it requires a permit; closed, and those are usually like private conservation areas; and open. So most of your multiple use areas, national parks, are usually considered open, and we get that data directly from our data stewards, or we make that decision based on what the designation type is. For example, if it's a national park, we always consider that open unless we hear otherwise. One of the other main attributes we track is conservation measures, which is what this map shows that I just very quickly made. So apologies if it's a little hard to read. And that's the one that probably causes the most confusion. So we track by biodiversity protection, but that doesn't necessarily mean biodiversity protection success. So it's what we assume if biodiversity was the same in every area we track, we assume a certain level of protection. So for example, wilderness areas we consider to be a GAP status 1, since disturbance events are mimicked. So usually mining, logging, extractive things aren't allowed. But as I think one of the papers I sent you, if it didn't, I can. A lot of protected areas such as wilderness don't necessarily have a lot of biodiversity, since they're usually in high elevation areas or difficult to access areas like mountains. But if there were a ton of biodiversity there, they'd be considered 1 just based on the management. And that goes all the way down to 2, which does allow some disturbance events, but they're suppressed, and biodiversity is for wildlife management is more or less considered a priority indirectly or directly based on management plans. 3 is multiple use, so those are usually national forests and BLM lands. That doesn't necessarily mean that biodiversity isn't protected. We just base it on what types of activities are used, and then there's unknown. And we also track the IUCN category, which is the International for Conservation of Nature category, and I don't have those pulled up right now, but that's more the international standard, which links to the World Database on protected areas, and how they categorize protected areas. And we actually do send our data to that database. And interestingly enough, not all of the areas in the US qualify for those categories. So if you look at a map on the World Database of Protected Areas, most national forests and BLM lands, for example, aren't included, and there's debate over whether or not they should be. So if anybody else needs another interesting paper topic, that would be a good one. And we also track source information. So if you look within the data, we pretty carefully track which agency it came from, the date that we received the data. So we have a pretty good reference point. So if there's a mistake, the agency can fix it, and vice versa. Again, this might be a little bit technical, but we have, they're called feature classes, and these are essentially layers within the database that are separate, and we do this on purpose because, as you guys are finding out through this class, there's a lot of land designations that overlap. So for example, there can be a wilderness, within a national forest. It's still a national forest, but it might be a wilderness designation on part of it. So first we track fee lands, and those are lands owned, outright by an agency, an individual, nonprofit, or other entity or state. We track designations, and those are things like wilderness areas or other protected areas that are designated by Congress or other similar mechanism. We track conservation easements, and those are area, I think you've done a little bit of reading on that, but those are private land with an agreement to conserve, not develop a certain area or conserve it in a certain way while maintaining that ownership. We also track marine protected areas, and those are huge in some areas. So we have a separate feature class for that. And then we have proclamation boundaries, and those are more administrative boundaries that don't necessarily have an ownership or management, clear administration or clear ownership or management boundary. So that's less of a legal boundary and more used for management purposes. And then we have a combined feature class. If you download the database, you can look at everything on top of each other. And this picture here on the right just kind of highlights how there are so many overlaps in this data, which makes it really, really complicated. So if you guys are interested in this database and using it either for reference or for your papers, hold on, I might have some questions. I can get to those later. What I would recommend is first going to the PADUS website, and I can send these around to the class at the end of the class as well, so you don't have to write them down. This provides information about the project, where it began. There's also an online viewer that's really helpful if you don't have GIS software. Green Info Network, which is a subcontractor, I guess, under USGS, they made a companion. They're a nonprofit in California that does a lot of public lands research. They have a companion site called protectedlands.net, and that has frequently asked questions, gets into some of the more technical stuff that I'm not going to be talking about, but it also explains, the whole process of how we put this together, various use, provides examples of how other people have used the data, and provides like general tips and tricks for people who are using the data. If you are into GIS already, you can download the data directly from the PADUS website, and we both have the geodatabase, which I think you need ArcGIS to run, or you could download the shapefiles, which doesn't include that organization of your different feature classes. There are also some KMZ files, which I don't use them that often, but I think they're compatible with Google Earth, which I think is free still. I'm not 100% sure on that. ArcGIS Online also has these layers online, and you can view those for free as far as I know. And again, I'll provide links to all these resources. For you guys, where I would really start out is with the web viewers, and that's available on the PADUS website again. From there, you can look at the data directly. You can zoom in, look up an address. You can view by various layers, such as by manager type, or by protection status, or by designation type. So, for example, you could look at you could look at your address and see which protected areas are nearby. And you could switch that to public access and get a general idea of what's accessible and what's not accessible. And just a disclaimer on public access, since a lot of what we do is categorical with public access, meaning we decide that category based on what type of designation it is. Don't always assume that it's legally open. Always double check if we accidentally trespass somewhere. And then protectedlands.net also might be a little bit more user-friendly web viewer, and you can do the same thing as what you would do with the USGS web viewer. You can choose different layers based on categories. I think this one's a little bit easier to navigate for new people, especially since you can play around with different transparencies. You can put a different base map underneath it, such as elevation. So it's a really more user-friendly, in my opinion, resource for you guys. And again, web viewers are also available through Esri, and you can go on ArcGIS online to find those. And I think you can sign up for a free account, but I'll provide links for those at the end of the presentation. Another really good resource is we have statistics available on the website, and those vary from both public access to the type of management. So we have, and we usually do those by acres and percentage. I think the newest version is up. I'm 100% sure on that, but I'll double check. These are from PADUS 1.4. We're now on PADUS 2.0 and soon to be 2.1, hopefully by the end of the month. But this is a good resource if you're looking for statistics on, how, for example, how many acres are managed by state agencies in California, or what percentage of protected areas in Idaho are considered a 1 or a 2, or what percentage are multiple use. You could do the same thing with public access, and those are luckily all pre-made, so they're really easy to use and you don't have to do any work. These are just some examples of things that I've done for class papers. So some of these are really old with GIS, especially using PADUS. So don't judge my poor map making skills from a couple years ago. I've hopefully learned since then. So this is an example for actually just something Dr. Freemuth asked me to do for just a reference of different vegetation types in craters of the moon. And this is all done using software. So again, it's really hard to do this just using the online databases. But if you do have access to software as a student or through other ways, I would recommend learning how to do these types of analyses. Basically, things like ArcGIS have pre-made tools where you don't have to know any coding, which is really nice. You just have to know the right commands and have the right data layers. So this just shows the different types of vegetation in craters of the moon based on, I believe it was from the GAP database on land cover. Obviously, most of it is sparse vascular rock vegetation, as expected. This is an example from a paper that I did on conservation easements, I think a couple years ago. And I just used this as a reference map. I was just curious where private conservation occurred in the US, especially when you zoom in. You can see that a lot of it occurs in the East Coast, which makes sense given the history of federal land in the West versus the East. This is probably the messiest map I've ever made, so apologies for that. That's a tip I would give you guys, is really learn how to use colors correctly, because this looks like spaghetti to me now that I'm looking at it for the first time in a couple of years. But this is for a paper I did for a water quality class where I was looking at the water quality of streams and lakes and reservoirs in Idaho by protection status. And I made, so you can make graphs accompanying the maps. Again, I would recommend that you learn how to use colors, because looking back at this, it's not super pretty. These are just a list of PADUS resources that I can send you guys. So you don't have to write them down. Again, there's the main website, the viewer, data downloads, web services, which can directly link to ArcGIS online, so you can view those maps pretty easily. And then ScienceBase, which is a little bit harder to navigate, but that's basically where a lot of things are filed in more of an academic manner for USGS. So that has a lot of the citations and different processing steps that are all in one place, so it's easier for them to track. Again, I mentioned the protectedlands.net viewer and the help system, and then Esri again. And if you guys decide to get use GIS for any of your papers, even if it's just for a reference map. These are just some sources that I put together that might be helpful that are beyond PADUS. Data.gov has a pretty good compilation of official government data. You can look at that by geospatial data only, and then you can filter by topics or keywords. So I've used that quite a bit. Like, for example, if I'm looking for population density information, that might be easier to find than going on the census website. But because I can search for it in this one database. Esri has some free training videos, which I would recommend looking at if you can't take a class or don't have time. And BioAtlas is another really cool resource that I found actually doing PADUS stuff, since they use some of our data. And it's free to register, but they have some pre-made maps and web viewers for a variety of environmental data, from everything from species richness to water quality, even some agricultural data. So it's a really good resource if you don't have GIS experience but want to look at some analyses that are kind of pre-made. Idaho Geospatial Office has specific Idaho data. The national map is USGS's, I think it's their main map, but it has a variety of combined layers, everything from elevation to transportation to protected areas, and other information. Topo maps are also available on USGS, and I haven't explored this much, but it looks really interesting. You can get historical topo maps, and you can compare those to current topo maps, and those are all available to download as images or geospatial data. ParkServe, I basically recently became aware of this since we added Trust for Public Lands ParkServe data into our most recent database. Basically what they did is they compiled for as many cities as they could. I think it was over 14,000 if I remember correctly. All the local parks and open spaces in major cities. And if you go on their website, you can look up your city and it gives you a score of walkability, access, and you can explore which parks are around your area or other cities. So if you're interested in some of the equity issues we've talked about in classes before with public access, especially to open spaces, that's a really good resource. Found this recently too. I haven't used it much, and I think Google Earth has a similar capacity, but ArcGIS has historical satellite imagery, and I think it only goes back to 2014 on ArcGIS, but you can look at an area and the satellite imagery from 2014, compare it to, let's say, today, and they try and do it by month, so it's fairly comparable. But that's really useful for looking at where development has happened. It's harder to do without more complex analysis on land cover change, but it gives you a good reference point. And as I mentioned before, the World Database on Protected Areas, that's through the IUCN and the UN. That's a really good resource if you're interested in the international context of protected areas. It has protected areas. It's a similar database to PADUS, except it's for the entire world, and they track different attributes. But if you're interested in international protected areas and where they are and how they're categorized, that's a really good resource. Some tips that I've learned with GIS is I do find taking a class helpful. I did learn on my own when I was working at the conservation nonprofit, just on a random project, and I volunteered to help, and that's how I learned. But taking a class really helps with learning some of the more technical aspects. And there were some things that I was doing that I realized that there's an easier way to do it, just with clicking the right button. Again, learn by practicing. So, sometime when I was first learning, I would just think of a project that was really on a small scale and do it and see if I could do it. And, that goes to the third point of having fun with it. I think I remember a story of Dr. Freeman telling me with a colleague of mine that he wanted to know where the breweries were in relation to national parks. And I don't remember what the results were, but that's something you can do with GIS. I think he was really just interested in where the breweries were for his next national park trip. But, And then for the most accurate data, always go to the direct source. Like I said, for PADGE-US, we only update federal lands on a yearly basis. Agencies like the Forest Service tend to update their data a lot more frequently. And that goes into always looking at the metadata, and that's basically a record. It's kind of like a reference record, and it has definitions of what's included in the data, as well as some of the restraints, like what you can't use the data for, what you shouldn't use the data for, and what you can and should use the data for. And then look at what others have been doing for ideas. I've gone to the ESRI conference a couple times, and unfortunately it was canceled with COVID this year, but I've always seen some really cool projects that gave me ideas, either for my dissertation research or things that I could do with PADGE-US. Okay, I think I wasn't looking at the time, but I think we have 15 minutes left for questions. So I will, hold on. Okay, so I'll try and moderate. Oh wow, there's a lot of questions. I'll go with the first one. It's from Christopher, and he's asking, which I'm not super familiar with, collection of phone data with the National Security Administration's mass collection of phone data is an illegal act, and the value of data and the safety information. Do you see any other drawbacks to the ability to map certain information? It's a good question. I mean, I don't see drawbacks in my field. So I actually see benefits of having publicly accessible information as long as it's not sensitive. And I think there are ways to protect that. For example, we get data from the National Conservation Easement Database. And obviously, since that involves private land, they don't give us personal details of the people who own that land. And they don't provide us with all the conservation easements if they are in sensitive areas or the landowner hasn't given permission to give that land. See, if public land were sold to a private owner and vice versa, how long is the period for an online map like GIS to be updated with new information? It depends on the agency or organization. I would say it depends. I think each agency has a different update frequency. I think private land is probably, don't quote me on this, it probably takes longer to register on any GIS databases. But I'm not, it depends on GIS database, a free program. ArcGIS Online is free. There are other programs out there that they're really coding heavy. So I would recommend just trying out ArcGIS Online first. And I'm not 100, I think BSU on their public computers has access to ArcGIS as well. If you go to some of the labs, that should be free for you guys to use. This GIS software been used for recording biodiversity and species reintroduction projects, for example, reintroduction of wolves. I'm not an expert on that, so it might be best to ask one of our future speakers speaking on wolf reintroduction on that, but I would say yes, at least, especially with the habitat availability in my work, which is more in land management. Knowing where those land management boundaries is always really important, even though animals don't really understand boundaries, legal boundaries. Obviously, it's good to know what areas are available. Obviously, you're not going to want to reintroduce wolves onto a bunch of private land. So, has GIS been used to study culturally significant sites, archaeological sites, for example? If so, are there map layers available containing this information? Yes, and the availability differs. Obviously, I think I looked into this a little bit when I was looking at Bears Ears. There's some archaeological sites that are sensitive that aren't going to be public information for good reasons, like to prevent pot looting. But there are, even at the state level, like culturally significant sites, like archaeological sites that are mapped out as long as it's not sensitive. It depends on the data. It depends on what type of data it is and how sensitive it is. Do you think there should be a greater effort to familiarize the general public with GIS data? And what ways is GIS successful in currently making the public aware in decision making, and what ways is improvement necessary? Wow, that's more of a question for probably somebody developing the software. I do think that making the public aware that this data exists at least is important. I'll give a good example. Sure, you guys, if you've been as obsessed with COVID and freaked out as I am, you've maybe looked at some of the state of Idaho websites and maps. A lot of that uses GIS data. So I do think it is used in decision making, especially with both the spatial aspect of looking at a map of where some of those hotspots are, and then attaching the actual numbers to that. GIS is really, really good. I think people respond visually to things more than just talking about it. So being able to show a map or a chart with a map, I think is a really important way of communicating. What got you working a lot into GIS? I'm interested in knowing about projects you worked on in GIS and it was for. The first project I worked on with GIS was when I was working at Defenders of Wildlife in DC, and it was on, I basically made a map. Little background, they were trying to look at where amphibians needed protection, and I made a map by watershed, and this is a really simple map where amphibians might occur or listed or endangered or proposed for listing amphibian species might occur within those watersheds. So it basically looked like a heat map, and it wasn't entirely accurate because it was by watershed, not necessarily species occurrence. And I haven't been working on a lot of projects now, since a lot of my job just involves compiling and translating the data, but I'm hoping to use it for my dissertation. We'll see how that works out. Did you say USGS is the easiest GIS data to use? I think you're probably asking, is USGS have the most accessible data? Depends on what you're looking at. I think most of the government agencies have pretty accessible data. It depends on how familiar you are with it. I'd say USGS is, since they are a scientific agency, it can be hard to find sometimes, but most of the agency data you can find from any of the land management agencies or other federal sources are pretty fairly accessible, especially since they usually have a web viewer or a link to upload the map to ArcGIS online. And again, it depends on the type of data. Raster data I found is really difficult to learn, but it's better for really complex analyses since it goes down to that, sometimes 30 by 30 meter level. Can you speak more about how you approach raw data? And Aaron, do you want to clarify what you mean by raw data?
Just as far as like accessing data that's not necessarily already in a GIS format, an example would be like going directly to the state and asking them, making a request for just like a table of their data, and then how do you take that and then refine it into a GIS application?
So luckily I don't have to do that, but I know some of our data stewards do, and that can range from I'd love to take a class on this actually, but I think a lot of that has to do with actually surveying the site and turning it into USGS or into GIS data. I do know that ParkServe, the organization or the project under Trust for Public Land that gave us local park data, I think, and we clarify this in our metadata for the latest update that we did. I think what they did for parks that didn't have GIS data yet, they basically went on Google Maps and found the parks and traced those in a GIS program, and we did choose not to integrate some of that data, especially if we had a better source, since it was not like a legal, it wasn't directly from a specific agency. It was basically just drawn, and the boundaries were probably iffy, but in my work at least, we define good data, based on the attributes that it has. So, we'll get data sometimes where it doesn't have an owner or manager name, and we can't figure it out because the agency hasn't given us that data. So that'll, it'll say unknown in our database. So the more complete the data is, at least as applied to my project, and then how recent it is, and then the agency that it came from. If we obviously do our best to collect data directly from the agencies as opposed to getting it from third parties, because that's updated more frequently. We have direct communication with that agency's GIS person. So hopefully that kind of answers your question. But I would like to learn more about how we deal with raw data too. I haven't done a lot of that. The closest thing I can think of is I did a project when I was interning at Idaho Conservation League once, mapping out a fence using GPS. And I ended up uploading it to Google Maps actually. But, obviously it was a little weird looking because I recorded the points at different places. So it didn't look like the fence. What are some of the things that you were doing that you found an easier option for in ArcGIS? So for example, statistics, like I was trying to I didn't realize until like a few years ago that ArcGIS actually had a statistics function. So I didn't have to use another program for statistics. So that was one example. There are just a lot of things I was doing manually as well. Like when I first started working on the project, I was manually entering information to each of it kind of looks like an Excel spreadsheet for each of the areas that I was reviewing, instead of realizing that I could select them all and calculate it out and apply it to 100 records as opposed to doing one by one. In your introduction, Brooke mentioned that another interest you had is wildlife biology. How do you think GIS can be best utilized to track species, communities, and monitor ecosystems? Well, I'm not a wild biologist, so I don't know if I can 100% accurately answer this question, but just based on the work that some of my colleagues do on species data, I think it would be great if there was more field work associated with species monitoring. So what they do is they have they model out species, predicted species habitat based on a variety of variables such as elevation, land cover type, whether or not it's a cliff or water, and they put all these variables into a database and basically predict where certain species are likely to occur, and that's all reviewed by biologists and everything. But we haven't really done a lot of work on verifying whether those models are correct. So I'm guessing that's true maybe across agencies, and it depends on the species too. But I think more field work for species monitoring needs to be done, so it's just not relying on modeling, if that makes sense. Any other questions? Didn't realize I would talk so fast. Okay. Science.
I guess I have another question on the data side of things. Is there, in the current administration, organizations like the BLM and the Forest Service there's moments in the recent history where they seem to be self-sabotaging. Is there any kind of limit to the access or disbursement of the data because of the new leadership?
Let's see, I'm going to get in trouble for saying something I shouldn't. I haven't noticed anything in like data accessibility, as far as I know, and I haven't, looked into every agency, but as far as I know, the same data is available. Maybe how it's being used is different. Like for our database, for example, I wouldn't say we're political, and I'm not allowed to be political, but it could be used for, and this isn't necessarily a bad use of our data either. It can be used for other things besides conservation, like oil and gas siting. So let's say you want to you want to know where, and this is how I think it should be used, looking for the least controversial places to do extractive activities. Because obviously there's going to be a lot more backlash if it's right next to a wilderness area or, a popular recreation area. So yeah, I haven't seen any limitations to access to data, but that's not something I've really looked into specifically. But I think the access is still there. And I think that, especially with recreation, that's a fairly bipartisan issue. So I do think that with my database, at least, there's a need and a desire to have information on, who manages what levels of public access there are. So yeah, that would probably be a better question for a specific agency that's involved in some of the political turmoil. Can GIS be used for environmental hazards such as flooding or landscapes that could help with hazard readiness for local communities? Yes. I haven't done a lot of that. In one GIS class I took, we did, I think it was in Italy. You can model, this is more complicated information, but you can look at things like elevation and historic floodplains, for example, and come up with predictions of when or which areas are at risk. I'm less familiar with the geological side of that with things like landslides, but I do know that there are databases out there of soil types. And then, I know USGS has, subsurface databases, things like minerals. So the answer is yes. I haven't done a lot of that, but I know there are a lot of people that do. Okay, any other questions? I promise my next presentation will be far less technical. I just wanted to introduce you guys to a resource. But I will send out to the class the website information if you guys are interested in providing maps in your research papers, or I'm willing to help with that as well. Yeah, unless there are any other questions, I think we'll end class a little early. Do I hear one? Yeah, and it is good to know that there is a free option for ArcGIS. See ArcGIS online, you do have to register, and you can't do a lot of analyses with that program, but you can at least visualize data and manage it and put it all in one place. Stephanie asked, the article about completing America's inventory of parks and protected areas is a plan laid out to complete PAD-US by 2020. Any idea of where we're at with that? Yes, we are actually, I don't know if I'm allowed to announce this yet, but we're supposed to be done by September 2020 anyway. We're pretty much done with the database, at least the current version of it, and a major part of that was integrating local parks, because that was the biggest data gap we had. And as you can imagine, based on especially some rural areas, GIS data might not be available. So that's why we had Trust for Public Land work with us and get us that data. And I think it's hard to say that you're always 100% complete with these types of databases, but for some states we had no local protected areas database. There were no data. There was no data on like city parks. Luckily, Boise wasn't one of them, but in our previous version, I think Boise was the only city in Idaho we had local parks data. So I'd say we have completed that goal as much as we can at the moment, based on the GIS data that's available. So the next version of PAD-US, when it's released, hopefully by the end of September, will have local protected areas data for most cities, except for some extremely rural cities that we didn't have contacts for. And then we already are fairly complete with state lands. There's probably still a couple data gaps depending on the state, and then we're mostly complete with federal lands, thanks to the really strong partnerships we have with the different agencies. Does ArcGIS Online allow you to input new data elements? Yes, it does. And I thought about presenting on how to do that, but then I realized it would get really technical. It's really not difficult. You basically, if you download a shapefile, which will be a zip file that most agency data or public data has an option for, if you just upload that shapefile, it'll show up in our GIS Online. And again, if any of you guys need help with this, I'm happy to walk you through it.